All right, so for more reaction to the medium-term budget policy statement, we're joined by Alternative Information Development Center Program Manager Dominic Brown, KPMG lead economist Frank Blackmore, and Fedusa's General Secretary Riefdah Ajam. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us this evening to give us your thoughts on that budget statement. Riefdah, we'll start with you. I mean, Fedusa put out a statement expressing your concern over that despite marginal improvements in debt and revenue performance, the statement fails to address the deepening crisis that's confronting the working class. What didn't hit the mark for Fedusa in the statement this afternoon?
Good evening to you and the viewers and the fellow panelists. Why we are a bit concerned, there have been a few areas that are positive, but at the same time, whilst the minister celebrates the stabilization of public debt and the improved fiscal outlook, our main concern is that this particular budget does not prioritize and continues to, or my apologies, let me rephrase that, the budget continues to prioritize consolidation, and it does not address the issues of compassion and financial discipline over social justice. Ultimately, and in essence, what we are saying is that the working class continues to be left behind and to shoulder the burden of austerity. What we would have wanted to see is that the reforms that he's speaking about here are technical and there's progress, but the jobs that we want to see and the reduction of those deepening levels of inequality is by no means improving in terms of what has been presented. It is in no means a balancing act, and we want to see greater levels of investment in this economy, greater levels of investment in social services where it is needed, ultimately education, health, social services, policing. Only in that way and by prioritizing those social spending will we be able to give meaning to the developmental notion that we would all want South Africa to see in driving this economy. So it's a little disappointing.
Dominic, Riefdah is saying that this prioritized consolidation and did not prioritize social spending. The MK party, when they reacted on the sidelines of the statement, they said that the minister missed four things, and that's unemployment, inequality, poverty, and land reform. What did this statement mean or say to you in any way this afternoon?
I wouldn't disagree with comments from the MK party nor that of Riefdah. I think there are a number of concerns which boils down to the fact that ultimately we're seeing the entrenchment of economic orthodoxy and the greater drive to de-risk private sector investments through various forms of guarantees, subsidies, and this is being unfolded through a range of blended finance mechanisms, including, for instance, the growing trend to borrowing from international finance institutions. And as we see the greater privatization of the economy in the energy sector and transport and water, for example, we're going to see a greater drive for cost-reflective tariffs. And so what this means is that services will become increasingly unaffordable for the majority of people, and the majority of people will be excluded from receiving basic services. There are a number of other elements or concerns relating to this, including the greater risks onto the state and how often public-private partnerships generally result in higher costs for investment than if these investments were just done through the public sector itself. I think the second major area of concern is the issue of the narrowing of the inflation target. Now, it's indicated that this will allow for lowering of interest rates, but this doesn't really make sense to me in the sense that generally, in order to achieve low inflation targets, the central bank has kept interest rates extremely high amongst the highest in the world. And this has a number of implications. First and foremost of which is that it, of course, increases debt service costs. And already households, 60% of their income or more is in debt, and almost 10% of their disposable income is paid back in debt repayment. And so as we see these high interest rates, of course, it means lower levels of disposable income, which really acts as a means of shrinking the economy. So you have a double handbrake being pulled up. On the one hand, you have this continued real cuts in expenditure, along with the throttling of local demand. But it also disincentivizes investment, particularly in sectors like manufacturing, where there are higher capital expenditure costs. And so it means you need to borrow more. And if the borrowing costs are high, it discourages these kinds of investments. So the response is that no, but expectations, inflation expectations will be the means through which to maintain low interest rates and low inflation. But this fails to consider that inflation is not driven by only expectations. In fact, there are many external factors, for instance, shocks, like increases in the fuel price, decreases or depreciation in the rand. But we've also seen inflation being driven by increased service costs by municipalities trying to raise or push for these cost-reflective tariffs, pushing more people into the margins. And so ultimately what this boils down to, as Riefdah says, the empty BPS, which continues to prioritize the guaranteeing of profits, shifting the risks of the private sector investments onto the state, and incentivizing more financial and speculative investments over investments in the real economy, where
Right.
jobs can be created.
Frank, let's bring you in there. I mean, Dominic speaks about that concern of lowering inflation to 3%, and he makes mention of a number of negative effects, which could be keeping the inflation low. The central bank would increase rates, making loans and mortgages more expensive for people, and this would obviously then slow down some of that economic growth. But what does this really mean for an average household in South Africa when it comes to cost of living in lowering this inflation rate?
I think the most important impact for the average South African home is whatever income they are earning, whatever wealth they own, will not be eroded at 5 or 6%, but now will be eroded by a lower 3%, right? So a lower inflation helps to preserve the buying power of that income and the value of whatever wealth they have, if they have a home, if they have an asset, whatever it is. That's the one way. The second way is if we are in line with our trading partners in terms of our inflation rate, it also preserves the value of the rand. Remember, if we have a much higher inflation than our trading partners, it means the rand needs to depreciate. We need to pay more rands to those countries in order to buy their goods. And obviously that results in imported inflation into South Africa. Now, if we equalize the inflation rates, that depreciation will be slower, so the inflationary pressures should also be slower. So those are two of the main benefits. The third would obviously be, from a business perspective, interest rates coming down because of this lower inflation. Instead of dealing with 4.5%, inflation, now we deal with 3% on average over time. You can, the Reserve Bank has said that would mean probably another 5 interest rate cuts once those expectations have been anchored at that 3% level. That means if you want to borrow money for a mortgage, or a business needs to borrow money, the rate or the cost of that money will be lower, given that lower inflation. So all those, I think, are positives because they would then help to incentivize further investment in the economy, further consumption spending, and that will boost our GDP growth.
So it really certainly is that balancing act between keeping those prices stable for consumers or just something that leads to higher borrowing costs. We are speaking about the finance minister and his midterm budget policy statement that he presented this afternoon. You can send us your comments and questions. So do WhatsApp us on 072-110-5584 or give us a call on 010-594-6010. Let's take a quick break. We'll be back with more after this. Welcome back. We are getting reaction on the Finance Minister's statement on the MTBPS. We are joined by Alternative Information Development Center Program Manager Dominic Brown, KPMG lead economist Frank Blackmore, as well as Fedusa's General Secretary Riefdah Ajam. You can also send us your questions on 072-110-5584. Give us a call on 010-594-6010. So, Riefdah, before the break, we were speaking about just the impact of that 3% lowering of inflation. And according to the statement that Fedusa had put out, there are a number of concerns that I want you to talk to us about regarding government's focus on fiscal discipline and debt stabilization. Do you think this comes at the expense of social programs?
Well, there's two sides of the coin that we need to engage here. Number one, when you look at it from a financial perspective, naturally, the improvement in terms of investment, managing the debt servicing costs better. But on the flip side of the coin, when we talk about inflation from a worker's perspective, all it serves is to erode the hard-won gains that workers have secured over the years, i.e., meaning that when we are going into wage negotiations, it's going to pull down the effect of what needs to happen. And we take this into account on the back of the high costs of electricity, of food and fuel prices. So that is typically called your household inflation. And when you take a look at the target that has been set now, including the flexibility of the band that has been introduced as well, it ultimately means that we are controlling a lower rate for wage increases, meaning that the disposable income that workers have, that workers will be able to extend to the families and the communities that they serve, are being ravished to virtually nothing. So the demotions in salaries and the drag that we are seeing will continue. So for Fedusa, this is not something that we welcome. We would have wanted further engagement on the matter to ensure that when we are able to advance on these particular issues, there's greater flexibility. Yes, in the past, we had the leverage of engaging on these matters, but that was as a result of collective agreements. But now that this has been implemented, what are we seeing? Workers have been struggling. There have been agreements that have not been honored. Many have been benefiting from these aspects. But for now, it ultimately means that there's going to be a pull-down factor, and that is not something that we had anticipated, even though there had been this disagreement between the governor of the Reserve Bank and the Minister of Finance. Ultimately, when we talk about social dialogue in action, it means that the level of engagements that we needed to see should have been there in order for us to take this to the next level. Many would advance the aspect that it would bring down inflation to some extent in terms of the goods basket, but it's already pegged at a very high level. So how do we even out those factors when we talk about a balanced perspective? Because
Sure.
already now, with wage negotiations being tougher than what they usually are, it ultimately means that workers continue to be on a back foot.
And very quickly, Riefdah, I mean, you emphasize the level of engagements. Is that why Fedusa was picketing outside Parliament this morning?
Absolutely. Absolutely. When we talk about the austerity that continues to fester within society, this is exactly what we are speaking about. When you look at South Africa and its ambitions to be a developmental state, we need to look at the investment into the economy. We need to be looking at investing in the key social services that drives the state, because ultimately the lack of investment, the number of critical posts within the state, and here we talk about education, we speak about health and policing, those critical posts that remain unfilled. Where is the social justice in that factor for the working class and for the poor? Because
Right.
it ultimately means that those posts remain unfilled. We continue to drag on the back of trying to consolidate. It is just not any form of justice in terms of what we are seeing. And for this reason, we continue to advance the notion that this budget is not pro-poor. And if already this is the trajectory that we are seeing, it is the only form of protest that we know. And we will continue to push back, because the balance that the minister talks about in reality is not being seen, because
Especially for
local
those within
economic
the working
development,
class. Yeah, let
absolutely.
me just try and bring in Frank here, because Dominic mentioned earlier that we are seeing greater privatization, particularly when it comes to transport, water and energy. And Frank, I mean, the minister spoke about structural reforms in energy as well as logistics. Do you think that these reforms could affect the prices that we pay for electricity, transport and other goods?
Well, hopefully from a positive perspective, and I think that's what we're all hoping. Remember, to date, if we look at the progression of Eskom, electricity prices are up, 600%? And that was pure public pricing. So the introduction of private sector prices and a competitive market are there to sort of bid those prices down, right? If you want to offer, you're not the only one, obviously, in the market that's offering. A lot of people have invested into alternative energy, various aspects of alternative energy, and are trying to supply that to the grid. And they have to compete with one another in order to be able to supply that to the grid, and that keeps costs down. We know that the costs now of this type of energy, the alternatives, is much cheaper than what we're getting from Eskom. And therefore, the diluting benefit should be to the benefit of South Africans in general. Remember, the other aspect here is also that governments sort of hit a fiscal limit. They don't have money to spend. Because of their non-austere ways, they have created a huge government debt over time, because they spend more than they get in terms of revenues. We know that debt service costs eat a substantial portion. What's it, 22 cents of each revenue rand goes to paying down debts. That's about, what was it, over R1 billion a day needs to be paid back. That should all be going into services for people, as well as infrastructure, in order to grow the economy. And it can't at this point, precisely because government hasn't been able to correctly manage its revenues in the correct areas.
Right.
So we're hoping that the introduction of private sector in certain logistical aspects, ports, rail, as well as electricity, will lead to a decrease in the costs of a number of those services, and that will benefit the economy at large.
Dominic, I see you reacting there when Frank speaks about more private sector involvement and how he spoke about the diluting benefits, especially when it comes to energy. What are your thoughts?
So I think we have to look at Eskom and the reason behind tariff increases. And in as much as Eskom is a state-owned enterprise, it's been corporatized since the early 2000s, which means that it had to run, and still is running, basically on a private basis and a commercial basis. And this is the cost-reflective tariff model. And under an unbundled competitive energy market, what we will see is...
For a moment there, I thought you were running a generator because we're speaking about energy, but yes, you may continue.
So when you look at this corporatization, it induces the full cost recovery model. And what has happened is that we haven't actually seen we haven't seen a complete full cost recovery model as yet. And
Okay, we seem to be losing Dominic there. Dominic, maybe just hold your thought. Let's just try and reestablish the line to you so you can finish that off. Let's quickly go for an ad break as we are discussing the Finance Minister's midterm budget policy statement that he delivered earlier today. Please stay with us. Welcome back. We continue to get reaction about the midterm budget policy statement from our experts, but we're also getting some reaction from you at home as well. We have a few of your WhatsApps this evening. HEM says, good evening. We appreciate the interest rate lower at 3%, but overall, the budget is always big figures and nothing on the ground. Luvuyo Dow from the Eastern Cape says, good evening, Newzroom Afrika. Great move by the Finance Minister. Lowering the inflation target to 3% will boost economic stability and attract investors. The decision shows commitment to prudent economic management. Hope it translates to tangible benefits for citizens. Fingers crossed for a stronger economy. And then Roberts from Umtata says, on the medium-term budget, the president has made the country unsafe for all. Nothing was said about GBV, crime, unemployment, and finally, the bloated cabinet. And last but not least, Siku says, good evening. The 3% target will definitely play a big role on price hikes going forward, especially on big commodities. All right, let's continue with our experts this evening. Dominic, as you wrap up the thoughts that you had before the break while we were speaking, maybe just to respond to some of those WhatsApps, it seems as though many South Africans are welcoming this 3% lowering of inflation.
There's so many things to respond to, but let me connect the dots quickly. As we see the move to a more competitive energy market, there's going to be a push for further entrenchment of the full cost recovery model. I anticipate that we will see rising tariff costs for energy. Now, this is a big driver of inflation. And so, especially when you have increased charges from municipalities. So you have to be able to reduce the cost of energy by making it fully public and not under private ownership, and remove the full cost recovery model. And another way to deal with inflation, which should be to put price caps on key goods and services, even rent control for that matter. Now, these are things that big businesses in the private sector won't like because it will reduce profits. Now, secondly, I want to say that we have to understand that the narrowing of the inflation band might sound nice because we don't want inflation, of course, but we must think about whether or not the means through which to achieve this lowering of the target is going to be effective. Secondly, I think it's important to consider that inflation sometimes can be an indicator of growth, more demand in the economy. And if we think about a proper reindustrialization program with more wages, more people employed, but we cap the prices on certain goods and services, this is what we must look towards, a real reindustrialization strategy, and not an emphasis on narrowing the target, but expanding the mandate of the SARB to say, let's deal with the issues of development, and not just the narrow inflation target that's generally coupled with high interest rates.
Riefdah, I mean, one of the WhatsApps from our viewers spoke about the focus on GBV and just strengthening some of the strategies with regards to curbing GBV, and there doesn't seem to be much of an increase when it comes to policing and security.
I cannot but agree with the SMS that has been received. It is absolutely unfortunate that we are entering within the next week and a half the 16 days campaign against no violence on women and children. Fedusa has been part of the move at the International Labour Organization to pressure government in terms of ratifying and domesticating Convention 190 that speaks of the elimination of all forms of violence and harassment against women. where government had, at the time in 2021, introduced a code of good practice, but we insisted that as a member state of the ILO, government should ratify and domesticate, because ultimately then it obliges to its reporting obligations to the ILO. What leaves us in despair at this stage is that during COVID, the President of the Republic had publicly announced that gender-based violence should be classified as the second pandemic in the country. Yet we are not prioritizing the particular spending towards safety and security. We speak about the National Development Plan and the particular targets that have been set, but ultimately nothing is happening. Fedusa had raised concern with not only the national minister, but also the provincial commissioner in the Western Cape, that GBV cases are being struck off the court rolls. Is it not a priority? What is happening here? And this is the very reason why we are promoting for a pro-poor budget, a worker-centric budget that places more emphasis on the fields of social spending, in particular safety and security. Today at the march, we had equally heard the calls of the communities in the Western Cape, where violence and harassment is a daily occurrence. So why is it that we are falling on our own swords by not prioritizing the safety and security, not just of women and children, but all citizens of South Africa?
Right.
So we have to advance on these issues, and we have to make sure that the prioritization, not only of job creation, but the reduction and the narrowing of that inequality and poverty that is fueling the levels of violence that we are seeing in the country has to be reversed. So ultimately, by plowing into social services, we will bring about the kind of relief that we are so desperately in
That's
search of.
much
But
needed.
talk is cheap.
Most
Talk is
certainly.
cheap.
Most certainly.
Unless we are not going to pressure the government around every corner, it is as if all these pleas are falling onto deaf ears. We can't keep on talking about pandemics and gender-based violence
And not actually put the
commemorating
resources towards it. I just need to get Frank's closing thoughts. Sorry to cut you off there, Riefdah. Frank, I mean, what would you say are the main concerns that you have with regards to the economic challenges that ordinary South Africans face?
Look, I think there are umpteen challenges. A lot of them have been addressed in this, high costs, lack of jobs, etc. But I think this came through quite clearly from the minister's speech today. He highlighted economic growth as sort of the main goal, obviously to address unemployment as well as poverty, that he did say. He said it would take structural reforms, both internally within the government, to get every rand efficiently spent on where it should. I agree with my fellow panelists at this point. This is not a pro-poor budget. It's not a pro-business budget either. If you just look at social grants and you take the monies going to health and education, which are your pro-poor expenditures, those are less than your public sector wage bill at this point. If you add to that your debt service costs, that's eating up 2/3 of the revenue, leaving maybe 1/3 to go to public services at this point. That needs to change over time. But in order to do so, we need to pay down this debt. And to do that, we need more economic growth.
Sure.
Growth will also supply more economic jobs and alleviate some of the stress on that side, and will allow government the fiscal room to be able to address some of these other social issues.
Dominic, in less than 30 seconds, we need to close off. I mean, Frank is saying this is not a pro-poor budget, but it also is not a pro-business budget. Just talk to us also just how South Africans can hold governments accountable for the effective use of budgets.
Well, the main mechanism is to vote parties into power that can actually amend the budget. There are public discussions, like inputs on the standing and select committees on finance, where I would encourage people to make submissions to increase the level of participation. in relation to the budgetary process. Of course, these are not democratic enough, and in some ways exclusionary. They're often held virtually and with a select few people. And I think the language of the budget is generally made to be mystified so that people don't understand what it is. But we need to demystify what it means and what the impact is. But I think that there should be also a call that in general there should be able to be much more democratic process in determining budgets that can prioritize
Sure.
the needs of people. So I think there's a lot of space. I think our budget process is more democratic than many other countries.
countries.
But I think it's still insufficient
All right.
in that regard.